Thank you, Doug. Thank you to ISO New England and the specific invitation from the Energy Council of Rhode Island. It's great to be here today. There's a lot happening in the energy world, as we all know. And I think we're going to get quite a set of diverse perspectives here. But maybe just one little note before I get into my presentation. I did read ahead a little bit, and I looked at the other presentations. And I think what's really interesting, and what I think will come out from all of the presentations, is just how difficult infrastructure projects are. And in the energy industry, where we all are relying on a reliable source of energy for our homes and businesses, I think it's often the average person doesn't really understand how difficult it is to build these projects. And whether you think that we ought to be investing in renewables or natural gas or new facilities of whatever kind, transmission pipelines, every one of them has very significant challenges to being built. And it's very, very difficult for us as a region to rely on any one resource. And diversity of resources is critically important, because we will see through these presentations just how difficult any single resource, how difficult the path to getting to completion of any kind of resource, particularly here in New England. I'm the CEO of Deepwater Wind. We're building the Block Island Wind Farm, the first offshore wind farm in the United States, and I'll get into the details in a moment, and then talk a little bit about the bigger picture of offshore wind globally and here in the United States. In addition to the Block Island project, we do own 2 federal lease areas that are about 25 miles south of the New England coast, about equidistant between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So that is a completely separate area from the Block Island wind farm, and those 2 lease areas are significantly larger than the Block Island project. We are principally owned by a company called D.E. Shaw, which is an investment firm based in New York with nearly $40 billion of capital. And the important thing to know about D.E. Shaw is that they've been in the energy and renewables business for a long time and have built thousands of megawatts of renewables, including here in New England through a company called First Wind, which developed a significant amount of onshore wind here in Maine. So a little bit about the Block Island project. We began this in 2008, as Doug mentioned. It's a 30 megawatt project, and for those of you who are not familiar, that's Block Island, and that's about 13 miles off the southern Rhode Island coast. That's a town of Narragansett at the tip of the mainland. And you'll notice that National Grid's logo is up there as well, and I'll explain why. The project is actually 2 projects. And if you start to the southeast of Block Island, those 5 dots represent the 5 wind turbines, which are 3 miles off the southeast coast of Block Island. Deepwater Wind owns that project, and that first line that connects those 5 dots, an export cable that connects the wind farm to a new substation that's on Block Island. And the second project is developed, built, and owned by National Grid. It's called the Sea to Shore project, which for the first time is connecting Block Island to the mainland of Rhode Island and the ISO New England market. Right now, Block Island receives all of its energy from diesel generators, and those diesel generators are fueled by about 1 million gallons of diesel each year, which is ferried from the mainland to the island. You'll note that we have a 48% capacity factor, which compared to an onshore wind farm is incredibly large. It is about 50% stronger than your typical onshore wind farm in New England, and maybe twice as strong as some of the older wind farms in New England. And that's part of the story of offshore wind. The wind is significantly stronger and significantly steadier offshore than it is onshore. We started the project back in 2008. Here we are in 2016. You can skip down toward the end. In 2016, we expect commercial operations to begin around November of this year, when we will be producing our first energy and delivering it to the mainland grid. In between that 8-year time frame, a lot happened. As you can imagine, the first offshore wind farm in the United States faced an incredibly uncertain regulatory structure. In fact, there was no regulatory structure. There was, at that time, no set of rules on how you went about getting the government approvals to put 5 turbines in the ocean in the United States. At the end of the day, we received about 20 different local, state, and federal government approvals. Surprise, surprise, that was not a coordinated process. We did it one at a time. There was no one-stop shop to get your permits to build the first of its kind project. It was a lengthy and a daunting process, but someone had to be first. And from the beginning, we recognized at Deepwater that the offshore wind industry, although it's quite large in Europe today, would never get a start anywhere before someone was first. And we had to start with one project, and we made the decision to start with a very small project. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of another project that had been proposed in New England called the Cape Wind Project, which was about 15 times the size of the Block Island project. That project has not been built yet. And we took a very, very different approach at Deepwater to beginning this industry. We decided that a small project made much more sense from a risk perspective and from the perspective of integrating it into our grid, getting regulators comfortable, getting utilities comfortable, getting policymakers comfortable with this new resource. And I think at the end of the day, our decision to start small was a very good one, and one that we were confident has been borne out by the results. Some photos on how we went about doing this. This is last summer, summer of 2015. That yellow structure is one of the 5 foundations that sits on the seabed, and that is the largest offshore crane on the Atlantic coast of the United States, lifting about 1,500 tons into the ocean. The water is about 75 feet at that particular location. And that foundation sits on the seabed and is essentially nailed to the seafloor. It is piled through each one of the 4 corners of that steel structure, which was partially built in Rhode Island, but principally built in Louisiana. And this is an interesting picture because that foundation is essentially the same sort of foundation that's used in the offshore oil and gas business. So one of the longer-term stories about our industry is that although we don't have offshore wind in the U.S., we do have very significant offshore energy capacity in the United States, in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. So there are lots of companies, firms that know how to do this. And part of our challenge is to bring that expertise here to the Northeast, where we're likely to be building a whole lot more offshore wind. Picture of our cable. This is the cable that's landing on Block Island. You can see the cable installation vessel there. We did all of the cable work in partnership with National Grid here in Rhode Island. And that cable installation went very, very smoothly over the course of the summer. So now there is a complete connection from southern Rhode Island mainland to Block Island, from Block Island to the wind farm. And this is a photo from just a couple weeks ago. You can see all 5 turbines in this photo. They're GE products. GE makes this offshore turbine. It's one of the largest in the world. It's a 6-megawatt turbine. You can see the vessel. There are actually 2 vessels in the bottom right of that photo. You can see the larger vessel from Europe and the smaller vessel next to it from the Gulf of Mexico. And that is actually the final piece of installation when that very last blade in the top right is being installed. That was the final moment of actual installation. At that height of that crane at that point is about 550 feet off the sea level. And the entire installation of the turbines, not the yellow foundations, but the turbines were all erected in about 18 days in August. So while it took us about 8 years to get to the moment when we could start installing those turbines, when we actually started the process, it went incredibly fast and very, very smoothly. So where do we stand today? All 5 are connected. We are working with GE to commission the project. We produced our first energy earlier this week to a temporary load bank located at our substation. And we expect a few more weeks of commissioning and testing So right around sometime in November, we expect to be exporting our energy from this project to the grid, and the first watt will hit the mainland grid sometime around November. And so far, so good. But Block Island's a small project, 30 megawatts, somewhere around 1% of the total load here in Rhode Island. But offshore wind outside of the US is a very, very big industry. And if you take a look at this chart on the far right, you can see there are about 11,000 megawatts of offshore wind in operation today in Europe. And it took, however, a long time to get there. So starting, the first offshore project was installed in Europe in 1991. And you can see that from 1991 to the early 2000s, almost nothing happened. It was a really small industry. There were onesies and twosies, as we like to say. Really small scale projects in one country and then another country. And then in the early 2000s, the industry started to explode. And the first half of this calendar year, about $15 billion US was invested in offshore wind in Europe. And we expect that by the end of this year, there will be more than 13,000 megawatts of offshore wind installed and in operation. So there is exponential growth in this industry, and every major industrial nation in Europe and now in Asia is very seriously invested in building offshore wind. And every major industrial corporation has a piece of this business as well. I mentioned GE. They are now very heavily invested in offshore wind technology, and one of their great global competitors, Siemens, is also very heavily invested, and a number of Japanese and Chinese firms are also making enormous investments in the industry. So it's an enormous growth area for technology. I'm not sure how easy this is to see, but this is an interesting perspective on scale. One of the stories about offshore wind is it is significantly larger and much, much easier to get to much larger scale than onshore wind. Your typical onshore wind turbine of 1.5 megawatts or so on the left is compared to the size of the turbine we're installing off the coast of Block Island, the 6 megawatt machine. When we started looking to buy a turbine for the Block Island project, a 2.5 megawatt machine was the industry standard. Within a year, it was a 3.6 megawatt machine. And a year and a half later, we contracted for a 6 megawatt machine. By the time we started installing a 6 megawatt machine, the same manufacturers we were talking to began telling us about their 7 megawatt machine. And last week, an 8 megawatt machine was installed off the coast of Northern Europe. And every manufacturer is talking about a 10, 11, or 12 megawatt machine, which would be 700 or 800 feet tall to the tip of the blade. So the investments that are happening in this industry right now are really enormous. And this is still an industry in its infancy compared to onshore wind, and compared to natural gas or coal or one of those other competing technologies. It's still a baby of an industry. But because we are seeing so much invested today, we're seeing technological advances that are almost too hard to keep up with. And the good news about this is that we're in a great place to actually deploy this technology. As we all know, we live in a densely populated area, as you can see by that satellite photo on the left. A lot of load, and it's all on the coast. And the other thing about this part of the world is property values are expensive, and people don't like infrastructure. They don't like to see infrastructure built in their backyards. It's just a way of life, which makes onshore infrastructure very challenging. The middle picture is a photo of wind speed. The darker the color, the better the wind. And those reds that you see off the southern New England coast, where the projects that Deepwater is interested in building are located, are world-class wind speeds, 9.5 meters a second or better. Every bit as good as the wind in Northern Europe. So it is a spectacular offshore wind resource, significantly stronger than any wind resource that you find onshore in this part of the world. And then finally, the good news for us at least is it's really buildable. That far right photo shows you the outer continental shelf, which is one of the largest continental shelves on the globe, which means that water depths are very shallow off our east coast. And you can go a few hundred miles off the U.S. East Coast and be in relatively shallow water of 1 to 250 feet deep. The opposite is true on the Pacific, where even a quarter of a mile offshore, you're in several thousand feet of water. So we have this confluence of events, a buildable area, an enormous resource, and a coastal population where things are difficult to build. And that is essentially the long-term thesis of offshore wind in the Northeast. So Deepwater Wind has, you can see Block Island on that photo, and that marked area to its right is our federal lease area. It has a capacity for about 1,500 megawatts of offshore wind. It's located smack dab in the middle of that really strong offshore wind resource. And our long-term plan is to build that project in phases over time and deliver energy both to the north, to New England, and to the west, to Long Island. And we have two competitors offshore that are directly contiguous to our east. Both of their areas are also about 1,500 megawatts in size. And very recently, in the state of Massachusetts, Governor Baker signed legislation calling for competitive solicitations to procure offshore wind over the next decade. And that will largely determine, I think, the pace of how offshore wind is built in the United States. But the economic case is getting increasingly favorable. The last auction that occurred in Europe was announced about a week ago. It was a competition in the Netherlands for a big offshore wind project. The winning bid came in at about 8 US cents for that offshore project. And about 3 months earlier, the winning bid for a project off the coast of Denmark came in at about 9 US cents. And there are lots of caveats and transmissions included in one and not in the other. But only about a year and a half ago, bids were in the mid-teens. And we are now seeing the technology advance to a point where this industry is becoming increasingly competitive. And we expect that here in the Northeast, where we believe offshore wind will be built at scale in the coming decade, that we will increasingly reap the benefits of that technological advance in the lower cost levels. So I'll turn the mic over and happy to answer questions later.